Yeah, we wanted to get you people thinking about how does this apply to me or my institution, and then have a good longish discussion with the three of us afterwards. So I'm going to say a bit about doing history, specifically history of science, of course, and throw in a few of my biased opinions. First of all, thinking historically. There are many things that are kind of like thinking scientifically, in that you have puzzles, you're trying to accumulate the best evidence you can to put together a coherent picture of a situation. That's very similar in the two fields of history and science, but then there are other things that are quite different. And here's some advice, unsolicited advice, to any of you that might think about writing a history article. And especially as a scientist writing a history article, there tend to be some errors that drive historians nuts. And here they are. So first of all, evoke the era, in particular what the actors knew and on what basis they made decisions. What capabilities did they have? So get into their shoes in a nutshell. Don't be talking about it from 50 years or a couple hundred years in the future and criticizing everything they did. Oh, they should have seen that. They should have seen this. If you say they should have, you probably are misunderstanding the situation. Because these are very smart people, usually smarter than you are, that you're writing about. Give the reader the uncertainty of the future. At that time, they didn't know what the future was going to be. There were many options to go as to where you put your resources, where you put your time, which cosmological theory you adopt, et cetera, et cetera. They did not know. And this leads on to actually, skip that one for now. Very difficult for scientists. Pay as much attention to all the wrong experiments, quote unquote, and publications as to those that turned out to be right. This is what drives historians nuts about a lot of scientists writing history, is that they only care about stuff that is right. Well, what does right mean? It means in 2016. Probably a third of that's going to be wrong 10 years from now, first of all. So you're really in this presentist bias, you're biasing there, but also you're not capturing what was going on then. So try to get out of that mind track. And in terms of one thing that is valuable, I would think, about history of science is how does science work? And you want to understand the paths that went wrong, where there was a huge commitment to something and it just was a bust. But to those very smart people at that time, that was a wise decision. Why did it go bust? And of course, often 50 years later, it turns out that it wasn't a bust. It was really insightful, but it just, for the next 20 years, it looked like it was a bust. So pay attention to all of the different avenues. Unpublished stuff. We all know we tend not to publish negative results. Or even we tend not to publish results that don't agree with what we really want to see. We wouldn't want to say that out loud like I just did, but but once again, of course, you get into the archives, you can begin to find much more about this than you can in the formal published records. Back one step here. When you're writing, minimize insertions of what later happened in the actors' futures. So don't constantly be coming in deus ex machina, the Greeks used to say, and saying, well, of course, now we know the universe expands. Well, it just destroys the story. Tell the story like it was at that time. And if you must have an appendix about how things turned out later, or if you want to put in a few odd footnotes or something, but don't, in my opinion, destroy the story by putting it in there as a major component. But, and this is where history of science is maybe different than history of politics or of the labor movement or of fashion. It does seem like we really do make progress in science, unlike we don't make progress in relationships between husbands and wives over the last 1,000 years. Maybe we have, but in any case, I think there'd be more agreement that we make more progress in science. So, does science have a direction? I mean, so this is debated quite a bit about historians of science. It's a conundrum that it does seem like we understand the universe much better now than we did 50 years ago, let alone 200 years ago. or 1,000 years ago. And so therefore, should we really spend all this time on the wrong avenues that angels on the head of the pin in the Middle Ages, for instance? It's a problem. There's not easy answers to a lot of these things. But anyway, those are some suggestions. So here, I went through a part of this this morning, but I'll just remind you, and I've got some new things here. My project started when I got my degree in 1971, and I looked around and saw that there were all these pioneers from World War II era, which were still alive, and I wasn't thinking about looking at their papers particularly. I was thinking about, well, you can actually interview them. That would be interesting. Supposing we had interviews of the late 19th century physicists who developed electromagnetic theory and what they would say about it. That would be fascinating to us now. And I think these are going to be fascinating the more we go into the future also. So over largely a 17-year period, I interviewed 256 persons that were active in the pre-65 period, almost all of them pre-1960. That was my main cutoff, but a few people were beyond, of which 115 were used for the book Cosmic Noise. Now, how did I identify those? Well, I went through very complete bibliographies that the Radio Physics Division in Sydney in particular spent a lot of time assembling every year. And I identified 340 persons as radio astronomy authors. Now, it's very subjective. There's a lot of people working in the ionosphere who do one radio astronomy paper. Well, I would put them in if they did one radio astronomy paper. But if they were mainly using Cygnus A to study the ionosphere, then I wouldn't put them in. I wanted to interview the foot soldiers, not just the generals. So this is a matter of how you're doing your history. Some people are only interested in Ryle and Hoyle. Other people want to see everyone that worked with them. What were their opinions of them and so forth. 17 of note had died before 1971 when I started my project. I really missed having an interview with them. Karl Jansky is the most obvious example. A further 14 died before I could get to them, so to speak. And now, in terms of the Cosmic Noise book, which is pre-1954, 87 of the 115 people that are relevant to that book that I used, their material, have died as of now. So, interviewed Canadians. I list the people here, and of course, some of these people are British and came to Canada and so forth. It gets mixed up a little bit. Also mined archives around the world. People like Ellen is just fantastic when they have it organized so you can tell what's there sitting in your home institution, and you can plan that's going to be worth 1 day for me, or that's going to be 5 days, rather than saying, well, we don't really know what we got, but over in that corner there is a lot of Ron Bracewell stuff, and you just don't know what it is, and even if they're willing to let you look at it, how long it's going to take you to process it. And all of my project stuff, not just the interviews, but all of the annotated photocopies and reprints and so forth are going to NREO. So this led to 2 books in the early 80s. I described those this morning, and then Cosmic Noise that Tim has said nice words about. And I love, speaking of annotation, he's got all these nice colored indexes in it. So, oh, sorry, that's on the Canadian Astronomy book, but he's got it on Cosmic Noise there also.
I just did that so it looked like Ariel.
Oh, I thought. Thanks for making me feel good here. Now, I ran short of time this morning, and I had to skip 2 audio clips. And I wanted to play another couple audio clips from the interviews because I think everyone enjoys them. And so here is Doc Ewan. You've seen this photo before, together with Purcell, the discoverer of the 21 centimeter line. And here is a clip from him about working with
Occasionally, I would put on the headphones when observing in the evening, just to listen to the heterodyne beat as that oscillator was being tuned. And I had an old comfort chair brought in and put in the lab, and I just closed my eyes and snooze a little, and I'd listen to that same whistle, and if it gurgled or popped, it was almost like babysitting. I'd hear him come to it, and then I'd also tell the night janitor what times to definitely wake me up. But I could tell that gadget, when it was running correctly, it had all sorts of, because of the number of gears and motors and everything, peculiar little noises going on. And so that I could walk into the room and I'd just listen and I could tell you whether a receiver was working.
And then one more from the Dutch side of the early 21 centimeter work. Here's the dish that they used in the sand dunes at Kootwijk. And here is Jan Oort and Henk van der Hulst in the early 1950s. And here is a quote from a much more formal Jan Oort in his interview. See, where's the, oh, here it is. Yeah.
We were in a pretty bad position after the war, not only because so much had been destroyed and we were poor, but also because Holland had not taken any part in the radar developments that had been going on in other countries during the war. And, so we hadn't anything like the experts that they had in Australia and England and in the United States. But our main advantage then was that the strong interest from the astronomical side.
Meaning me, Jan Oort. So now, let me end up talking a little bit about interviews, the pitfalls and the positive aspects. I love this quote from Mark Twain. When I was younger, I could remember anything, whether it happened or not. But I'm getting old, and so I soon shall remember only the latter. And then Jesse Greenstein. So all the interviews that I transcribed, I didn't have enough money to transcribe them all, or frankly, interest. So I focused on the most valuable ones. I would send it back to the interviewee for their comments and corrections and additions if they wanted to. So Jesse Greenstein wrote back, I find the transcript of our conversation really almost useless as a guide to either what I thought or what you know. I will in time try and send you a drastically cut and edited version, which of course never came. But he signed the release sheet, so that's all that matters. So in Cosmic Noise, Appendix B, I'm going to be taking some words from that, which is about the interviews, a listing of all the people, but then also some of the philosophy of doing them and what other people have said. One historian of science has talked about oral history practices, saying memories are sculptured by subsequent events, buffeted by denial and repression, hammered into self-reflective and self-justifying narratives. Well, yes, this is true. I was talking about husbands and wives before. You can get that kind of thing going there too. So this would say it's useless. And the traditional historical point of view has been that the written word is God. History does not begin, in fact, right? That's the dividing line between history and archaeology. Only once you have writing do you have history. And only the written record is of value. Now, most historians are not that dogmatic about this. They are willing to take other kinds of evidence, in particular materials and objects are of great value. But in any case, there are people that feel like they're just so biased for so many points of view that it's a problem. And also, interviewing scientists, as opposed to the politicians or whatever you want to interview in your local town, they have been trained to think logically and to put together a paper as a logical development of how things went, when usually it's not how they went at all. It's how I wish they had gone if I'd done it the right way, and I want you to see how logical I was in setting up the experiment and doing my checks, and then how great I was coming to conclusions. And you don't talk about the dead ends and so forth. And of course, that's the value of not just looking at the published record. But the scientists, when you ask them, well, how did you get the idea and so forth, they will have developed a story in their mind that is not going to be irrational, certainly, right? No one's going to come forward with a very irrational thing. And it's often going to be quite constructed. But there are many positive things for interviews. First, cognitive research has shown that people do remember social interactions very well from the distant past and the scientific milieu and so forth. Secondly, they provide a different class of historical evidence that's quite different from the published record, and you still need to supplement it. You still maybe need to have the journalist rule that you need at least 2 independent sources before we're going to run with it. But maybe the oral record and the published record could provide those. But another part is that the written record can be very biased too. I mean, Ellen is determining what gets saved. And she likes Ron Bracewell, obviously. She comes along and sees these letters and tosses them out that show him in a bad light. Now, most archivists don't do that, but a lot of people do that are famous. They say that people are going to be looking at this. I'm going to call out stuff that's going to make me look bad 100 years from now. So the written record can be quite biased also. The other thing is that from documents you cannot get tacit knowledge that was, everybody knew it at the time, so nobody had to write it down. But a well-constructed interview will say, well, why did you do that when so-and-so at the other institution was doing it a different way? Or why were you doing it both the same way? Well, that was obvious because we had shown this, but no one's ever published that. So you can only find this out through the written record. First, and of course, you learn about personalities. By meeting the person, you get a lot of the personality that you certainly don't get from your astrophysical journal papers. Quotations, I firmly believe that they add a lot of spice and a lot of interest to a historical account. And finally is the matter of the digital dark ages that have set in the last 10 or 15 years that, I'm now working on a biography of William Herschel, and I can just look at the papers and the letters that he wrote 200 years ago, and I can just read them, no problem at all. Can I read your email from a week ago, or can anybody read your email from a year ago? It's just going to be lost. I don't think it's going to get solved. And so oral history becomes all the more important in these digital dark ages than it used to be when correspondence, put a stamp on it kind of correspondence, was the norm. A couple more points. Insider versus outsider. So in doing my project, I was obviously an insider, a radio astronomer talking to my colleagues, even though many of them I didn't know before I met them. But nevertheless, I knew the lingo, and that helps a lot, establishing a rapport. But it also means that I may not ask the right questions that a journalist type that comes in kind of not knowing anything would ask. It's the anthropologist problem, right? The anthropologist wants to understand the culture as much as possible. They go live amongst the people in the jungle for years and years, and then they get co-opted, right? They become part of them, and they cannot then, in any objective manner, analyze them. And so there are pros and cons as to whether to work on your own field or not. How long are the interviews? A proper oral history is at least 4 or 5 hours. You go through the entire person's life, what religion were you raised in, how many siblings did you have, on and on and on. I was not doing that. But other people want to do that kind of a thing, and obviously you can only do it for many fewer people. My interviews averaged about an hour. Many of them were only 15 or 20 minutes when a person had only had 2 papers before 1960 that were relevant to radio astronomy, for instance. And then finally, the issue of transcripts. We've already seen that. I put up here the version that I put in the book, but that's not even the version that's in the transcript. And so how much do you clean up things that people say? And might you be changing their meaning by doing that? You're certainly changing the way they speak. which is, I think, of great interest to hear how Martin Rowell really spoke as a person, as opposed to how he wrote his papers, and how I will quote him sometimes in the book. So these are some ideas that I've learned from my project. And now on to Miller.